When you're searching for answers to a challenging problem, the solution often hides in plain sight. Arthur Lehman stood at a bustling downtown crossroads, his mind fixated on a singular mission. He needed someone who could assist him with his predicament. No strings attached, no unnecessary complications. And that's when he saw her. Angela sat on the edge of the sidewalk, gripping a worn-out coat tightly against the biting chill. Her disheveled hair framed a face that, despite her dire circumstances, carried an unyielding mixture of bruised pride and quiet determination. The stark contrast between her hardship and resilience snagged Arthur's attention like a hook. Without a second thought, he approached her. His tall, confident demeanor turned heads as he crossed the crowded street and stopped just before her, crouching slightly in an effort to soften the impact of his presence. "Hello. My name is Arthur Lehman," he began, his voice calm but resolute. "I have a proposal for you." Angela looked up, her expression guarded. People in her position rarely heard proposals that offered anything worthwhile. "I'm not interested in charity," she shot back, her tone sharp and unapologetic. A faint smirk tugged at Arthur's lips. Her defiance intrigued him. "This isn't charity. It's a job," he countered. "If you take it, you'll have a roof over your head, meals, and a significant sum of money when it's done." Angela's eyes narrowed, her skepticism growing. "What kind of job?" she asked, her voice laced with doubt. "I need you to be my wife for 9 months. The statement hit her like a thunderclap. Angela let out a short, incredulous laugh, but Arthur's steady expression told her he wasn't joking. He explained that the arrangement would be purely for appearances, with clear terms and conditions. In exchange, she'd receive more money than she had ever imagined, enough to completely turn her life around. Angela hesitated for several long moments. The weight of her desperation pressed against her pride. Eventually, Need won out. "Fine," she said, lifting her chin slightly. "But I want everything in writing. I won't be taken for a fool." Arthur nodded approvingly and motioned for her to follow. Without much explanation, he led her to a private clinic. Inside, Angela underwent a series of medical exams conducted by a seasoned doctor who appeared to have a long-standing connection with Arthur. Though she found the situation strange, Arthur dismissed her concerns with practiced ease. "This is just to make sure you're healthy," he said smoothly. "You'll be living in much better conditions soon." The doctor eventually handed Arthur a detailed report, confirming Angela was in good health. Arthur scanned it with measured relief, careful not to let his satisfaction show. His plan depended entirely on Angela being physically fit, and most importantly, capable of carrying a child. However, he wasn't ready for her to know that part just yet. As they left the clinic, Angela's sharp gaze flickered toward him. "Why all these tests? It's not like I'm actually your bride," she remarked, her suspicion evident. Arthur's eyes stayed forward. "I just want to make sure everything goes smoothly. Nothing can go wrong while we're married," he said cryptically, his tone leaving her with an uneasy chill. Sensing she wouldn't get a straight answer, Angela decided to hold her questions, for now. Later that night, as their agreement moved into its next phase, Angela couldn't shake the unease building within her. What had she really signed up for? The drive to Arthur's mansion felt surreal, like an escape into another reality. The noisy city faded behind them, replaced by wide, pristine streets lined with towering trees and sprawling estates Angela had only seen on television. She sat silently in the car, her eyes glued to the window, while Arthur remained beside her, scrolling through his phone as if it were just another ordinary day. When the car finally pulled to a stop, Angela found herself staring at an imposing iron gate. As it creaked open, her breath hitched. The property beyond was beyond anything she had ever dreamed. A vast, palatial estate that seemed plucked straight out of a fairy tale. For a moment, she was speechless, overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of the world she was about to step into. The mansion loomed before them, an architectural marvel with a stately facade, sprawling windows, and gardens so immaculately maintained they looked almost artificial. "Welcome," Arthur said, his tone detached, as though the grandeur meant nothing to him. Angela inhaled deeply, her mind racing to make sense of the surreal situation. For someone who had spent countless nights on the streets, scrounging for survival, this felt like stepping into a world that didn't belong to her. "You live here?" she asked, awe evident in her voice. "This is where we'll live for the next 9 months," Arthur replied, a faint smirk playing on his lips, but his tone carried an unsettling chill. Inside, the mansion's opulence left Angela speechless. Crystal chandeliers sparkled from towering ceilings, the marble floors gleamed like mirrors, and the furniture was so lavish it seemed absurdly out of reach for someone like her. She cast a sidelong glance at Arthur, trying to grasp how anyone could live amid such wealth without it weighing on their conscience. Before she could take it all in, a stern-faced, middle-aged woman appeared, moving with an air of practiced efficiency. "Mr. Lehman, everything is arranged as you instructed," she said, her sharp gaze flickering briefly to Angela. "Thank you, Laura," Arthur replied curtly. "This is Angela. She'll be staying here for some time. Make sure everything goes as planned." Laura nodded, but the glance she gave Angela carried a hint of disapproval, or perhaps curiosity. Either way, it made Angela feel out of place, like an intruder in a world she had no right to enter. Arthur led her down a grand hallway to a bedroom that seemed almost magical in its design. The walls were a soothing blend of whites and soft blues. The bed was oversized and inviting, and the decor radiated understated elegance. "This will be your room. I trust it's sufficient," he remarked, his voice laced with subtle irony. Angela forced a faint smile. "More than sufficient. It's bigger than any place I've ever called home." He didn't respond, but his expression flickered for a moment, as though he understood the weight of her words. Still, he remained stoic, gesturing for her to follow him once more. They descended to a spacious room filled with people. A flurry of stylists, makeup artists, and fashion consultants, each armed with tools to alter her appearance. Angela froze, her brow furrowing in alarm. "What's all this?" she asked sharply. "You need to look presentable," Arthur said, his tone practical yet unyielding. "Our arrangement will fall apart if anyone doubts the legitimacy of our marriage." Angela folded her arms across her chest, feeling like a specimen under a microscope. "So you expect me to act like your flawless wife, is that it?" Arthur's lips curled into a faint smile, but there was no warmth in it. "Not act. Look, there's a difference." Reluctantly, Angela surrendered to the team. For hours, she endured endless fittings, hairstyling, and makeup applications. Each outfit was more extravagant than the last, each adjustment pushing her further from the person she had always known herself to be. When it was finally over, Angela stood before a mirror and stared at her reflection. The transformation was astonishing. The woman staring back at her was polished, poised, and elegant, like she had always belonged in this world of luxury and excess. "I look like someone else," she murmured, her voice tinged with disbelief. Arthur sat in the corner, his sharp gaze fixed on her. He didn't offer any compliments, just a subtle tilt of his head. "You're ready," he said simply. The words felt hollow to Angela. No matter how much she looked the part, she knew it was all an illusion. Still, as she gazed at her reflection, a tiny ember of hope flickered in her chest. Perhaps the strange opportunity could be her chance to escape the life she'd left behind. When Angela turned to Arthur, searching for a hint of approval in his expression, all she received was a slight tilt of his head. "You're ready now," he said flatly. The words felt hollow, their meaning weighed down by the artificiality of it all. Angela knew the polished, glamorous woman she now appeared to be was nothing more than a facade. And yet, despite herself, a flicker of hope stirred within her. Perhaps, just perhaps, this peculiar arrangement could offer her the fresh start she so desperately needed. Later that evening, Laura entered Angela's room carrying a tray of food. Her movements were brisk, but as she set the tray down, she lingered, her demeanor hesitant, as if debating whether to speak. "Is something wrong?" Angela asked, picking up on the woman's unease. Laura sighed, carefully choosing her words. "Mr. Lehman is a complex man. He never does anything without a very specific purpose. Angela's brow furrowed. What are you trying to say? It means that if he brought you here, there's more to it than what he's told you. Be cautious, girl. Before Angela could press her for details, Laura turned and left, leaving behind a swirl of unease and unanswered questions. That night, Angela lay in the soft, luxurious bed, but sleep evaded her. Her thoughts raced, tangled in a web of doubts and questions. Why did Arthur need a sham marriage? What was his true motive? And, most unsettling of all, why did she sense that beneath his cold, detached demeanor, he was hiding something deeper? Elsewhere in the mansion, Arthur sat in his office, flipping through Angela's medical reports. The results confirmed what he needed. She was healthy, capable, and a perfect candidate for the role she was unknowingly destined to fulfill. Yet, as he studied the reports, his thoughts drifted to Angela herself. Her defiant gaze lingered in his mind. There was something about her, an unyielding fire that made her stand out in a way no one else had. Perhaps it was her courage, her willingness to challenge him even when the odds were stacked against her. Shaking his head, Arthur pushed the thought aside. He couldn't afford distractions. His plan was carefully laid out, and he couldn't let sentimentality derail it. This was business, nothing more. The next morning, the mansion hummed with quiet efficiency. Angela was woken by a knock on her door. Laura entered, punctual as always, carrying a breakfast tray and wearing her usual no-nonsense expression. "Mr. Lehman requests that you be ready in an hour," she said, setting the tray on the table. "He has some engagements today and expects you to accompany him." The request struck Angela as odd, but she bit back her questions. Refusing wasn't an option, not yet, at least. If this arrangement was going to change her life, she'd play her part to the letter. After dressing carefully, Angela descended to the grand foyer, where Arthur awaited her. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored gray suit, exuding authority with every calculated movement. He glanced at her briefly, his gaze assessing, as though she were a prized acquisition. "Shall we?" he asked, his voice as measured as always, opening the door for her to step into the car. During the drive, Angela tried to make conversation, but Arthur's responses were terse, his mind clearly elsewhere. Whatever his thoughts were, they remained locked away, leaving Angela feeling like little more than a cog in his grand plan. The car eventually pulled up in front of a discreet private clinic, its modest exterior a sharp contrast to the earlier opulence. Angela frowned, suspicion flickering across her face. "More tests?" she asked, her tone sharp with irritation. "I thought we were done with all that." Arthur didn't meet her eyes, his tone steady and composed. "I need everything to be flawless. There's no room for complications." Angela frowned, still unsure why he was so insistent on perfection. But she complied, following the doctor waiting for her in the reception area. The man was soft-spoken yet methodical, his questions exact and probing. As the examination went on, Angela felt more like a subject being analyzed than a person. The sterile, impersonal nature of it all began to wear on her. While Angela was in the examination room, Arthur waited in the lounge. His usual calm facade remained intact, though the faint tension in his shoulders betrayed a hint of unease. When the doctor returned with an envelope, Arthur took it without hesitation. "The results are excellent," the doctor reported. "She's in perfect health." Arthur gave a curt nod, though his jaw tightened slightly. Despite the confirmation that everything was proceeding as planned, an inexplicable discomfort gnawed at him. Angela was more than he had anticipated. Her strength and sharp mind were becoming undeniable, making her far more complex than the simple role he had envisioned for her in his scheme. When Angela emerged from the room, her expression carried a blend of irritation and curiosity. "Those questions, they were strange. Is that normal?" she asked pointedly. Arthur shrugged, his tone cool and dismissive. "Doctors are thorough. It's nothing to worry about." She crossed her arms, her distrust clear, but for now, she chose to let it go. Something felt off, but she needed more information before challenging him. Later, As she wandered through the sprawling mansion, Angela marveled at its grandeur. Every corner seemed designed to flaunt wealth, from the intricate paintings adorning the walls to the plush Persian rugs lining the halls. Yet, despite its beauty, the atmosphere felt staged, as if it lacked genuine warmth or life. While exploring, she passed by a partially open door and paused. Inside, Arthur was on the phone, his tone firm and commanding. "I want every aspect of the plan executed perfectly. We can't afford even a minor mistake." Angela leaned closer, her curiosity piqued, but Arthur's sharp instincts kicked in. Spotting her shadow by the door, he quickly ended the call and shut the door firmly. Angela shivered slightly, a sense of foreboding creeping over her. What was he planning? During dinner that evening, Angela attempted to broach the subject delicately. "You always seem so busy," she said casually, studying his expression. "Big project at work?" Arthur smiled faintly, a calculated glint in his eye. "My work demands a lot of attention, but it's nothing you need to concern yourself with." Angela recognized the deflection immediately. He was a master at avoiding direct answers. Yet, behind his composed exterior, she sensed something deeper, an enigmatic side he guarded fiercely, even from her. After dinner, Angela returned to her room, but sleep eluded her. The way Arthur interacted with her gnawed at her thoughts. He was attentive but emotionally distant. At times, she caught glimpses of genuine concern, but he quickly buried them beneath his usual cold detachment. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to him than he let on, and she resolved to uncover the truth. The next morning, while Arthur was absorbed in a meeting, Angela saw her chance. The door to his office was unlocked, and she cautiously slipped inside. The room was immense, its walls lined with shelves overflowing with books and documents. At the center stood an imposing wooden desk, perfectly organized but radiating an air of authority. Angela's eyes darted around, searching for anything that could give her insight into the man who controlled her life. Angela moved cautiously around the office, her eyes scanning for anything that might offer insight into the enigmatic man she had married. Her attention landed on a partially open drawer. Inside was a folder with her name written neatly on the cover. She hesitated, her heart pounding, but curiosity won out. Opening the folder, she found an unsettling collection of medical reports and meticulous notes. As she flipped through the pages, the truth began to dawn on her. These tests had been planned long before she ever signed the contract. A chill ran down her spine. What was Arthur really after? "What are you doing?" Arthur's voice cut through the air, freezing her in place. He stood in the doorway, arms crossed, his expression unreadable but undeniably stern. Angela scrambled to find her words, instinctively clutching the folder closer. I was looking for answers," she admitted, her voice firm despite the guilt flickering in her chest. Arthur walked toward her, his movements deliberate, and gently took the folder from her hands. "You're right to want answers," he said, his voice low but steady. "But this isn't the way." Angela crossed her arms, refusing to back down. "Then tell me the truth. Why all the tests? What do you really need from me?" Arthur exhaled deeply, as though carefully measuring his response. "I have my reasons, Angela," he said after a pause. "But I promise you, none of this is meant to harm you." His words hung in the air, but they did little to ease the storm brewing in Angela's mind. She stared at him for a long moment before turning and leaving the room, her frustration mounting. Manipulated and kept in the dark, she couldn't ignore the gnawing sense that Arthur was hiding something far bigger than just business. As she walked away, Arthur glanced down at the folder in his hands, his expression uncharacteristically conflicted. He had always prided himself on control, but Angela was slipping through his grasp. For the first time, he questioned whether bringing her into his plan had been a grave mistake. The next morning, an uncomfortable silence settled over the mansion like a thick fog. Angela couldn't shake the images of the folder's contents or Arthur's cryptic words. She resolved to uncover the truth, no matter what it took. Meanwhile, Arthur buried himself in his work, though his focus was faltering. Angela's presence was becoming a disruption. Her determination and resilience stirred something in him, something he couldn't quite name. It unnerved him. Feeling suffocated by the mansion's grandeur and secrets, Angela decided she needed a break. After a brief conversation with Laura, she was granted permission to stroll through the gardens. The sprawling grounds were immaculately maintained, but to Angela, they felt more like a gilded cage, a prison masked by beauty. As she walked, she found a quiet bench near a bubbling fountain. Sitting down, she let her thoughts wander. What did she really know about Arthur? He was powerful, calculating, and burdened by layers of secrecy. But what about her? How much did he truly know about her life? And why was he so invested in her medical tests? Back in his office, Arthur sat at his desk, sifting through reports from his private investigator. He had spared no expense in uncovering every detail about Angela's past before offering her the deal. Yet, as he read through the meticulously compiled information, he felt an unusual pang of regret. She had intrigued him, yes, but there was more to her than he had anticipated, qualities that were beginning to unsettle the carefully laid foundations of his plan. As Arthur flipped through the pages of the investigator's report, the picture of Angela's life came into sharper focus, and it was far more heartbreaking than he'd imagined. She hadn't always been on the streets. Her family had lived modestly, but their lives took a devastating turn after a financial collapse wiped out their savings. Not long after, tragedy struck again. A car accident claimed her parents' lives, leaving Angela utterly alone and without a safety net. Arthur felt an unfamiliar heaviness settle in his chest as he closed the folder. He was a man who thrived on logic, facts, and calculated decisions, but there was something deeply unsettling about her story. It made him question, for the first time, whether his carefully constructed plan was justifiable. Could he really put her through even more, knowing the depth of the pain she had already endured? Later that day, Arthur found Angela in the mansion's library. She was curled up in a plush armchair, a book resting in her hands. The soft afternoon light streaming through the tall windows framed her figure, making the room feel almost serene. As he entered, Angela closed the book and glanced up, noting the unusual expression on his face. "You look like you have something on your mind," she observed, her curiosity piqued. Arthur hesitated, his usual confidence wavering. "I've been thinking about how you ended up where you were," he admitted. "I want to understand your story, Angela. I want to know everything." Her expression hardened slightly, and she averted her gaze. "Why do you want to know? It doesn't matter. It's not going to change anything," she said, her voice edged with defensiveness. Arthur took a step closer, his tone softer than she'd ever heard. "It matters to me. I want to know who you really are." Angela sighed deeply, grappling with the vulnerability his words demanded. She considered brushing him off but saw something in his eyes, a sincerity that disarmed her. Reluctantly, she began to speak, her words slow and deliberate, as though each one came with a weight she'd long carried. "My life used to be simple but happy. My parents worked hard, and while we didn't have much, we had enough. Then, everything fell apart. They lost all their savings in a financial collapse. We tried to recover, but it wasn't enough. Things just kept getting worse." Arthur remained silent, his focus unwavering as he listened. "And then came the accident," Angela continued, her voice trembling. "A truck hit their car. They were gone just like that. I didn't even get to say goodbye." Her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles white as she fought to hold back tears. "After that, I was alone. Too young, no experience. No one would hire me. I couldn't even pay rent. Eventually, I was evicted." She paused to take a shaky breath. "And then, I ended up on the streets. I scavenged for food, begged for scraps. People don't care who you are or where you came from when you've lost everything. You become invisible." As her voice cracked, tears began to stream down her face. She lowered her head, trying to conceal her emotions, but the effort was futile. Arthur felt a lump rise in his throat as he watched Angela, who always seemed so strong, unravel before him. Without thinking, he knelt in front of her, meeting her at eye level. "Angela," he said gently, his voice filled with a rare tenderness. She quickly tried to wipe away her tears, but Arthur reached out and pulled her into an embrace. For once, he didn't care about maintaining his usual cold distance. "I'm so sorry for everything you've been through," he murmured, his voice low but brimming with sincerity. The warmth of his embrace and the honesty in his words caught Angela off guard. For a brief moment, the walls she'd so carefully built around herself began to crack, and she allowed herself to lean into his comfort. Even if it was fleeting, it was a balm she hadn't realized she desperately needed. Angela froze in place, startled by Arthur's uncharacteristic embrace. Slowly, the tension in her body eased, and she allowed herself to lean into the comfort he offered. She had spent so long trying to carry her burdens alone that she hadn't realized how much she needed this simple moment of connection. I just wanted a chance to start over," she murmured through her tears, her voice fragile. "You deserve far more than that," Arthur replied, his tone unexpectedly resolute. The words surprised even him, carrying a conviction he hadn't intended to reveal. They stayed there in silence for several minutes, the weight of unspoken understanding settling between them. Arthur held her gently, as though afraid she might shatter. When Angela finally pulled back, her tear-streaked face held an expression of quiet gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice faint but sincere. Arthur nodded, though he knew his words alone could never be enough. He felt a growing need to do more for Angela, even if it meant challenging the rigid plans he had constructed. In the days following their heartfelt conversation, the relationship between Angela and Arthur began to shift subtly. What had been a cold, transactional arrangement started to feel more nuanced. Arthur's guarded demeanor softened. He became more present, more attentive. Angela, though still cautious, began to notice glimpses of a man far more complex than the detached, calculating figure she had initially known. One morning, Angela was in the garden, carefully tending to the flowers. Laura, who had been supervising, remarked that the plants had never looked better. For Angela, the task was a small reprieve, a way to ground herself amidst the chaos of her circumstances. Arthur stood on the veranda, watching her with an unreadable expression. His gaze was distant, but his focus never wavered. Laura approached him, carrying a tray of coffee, her steps measured with the familiarity of someone who had served him for years. "You've been different lately," Laura said casually, setting the tray down. "Different how?" Arthur asked, his eyes still fixed on Angela. "I don't know. More human, perhaps." A faint, almost imperceptible smirk crossed Arthur's lips. "That sounds suspiciously like an insult." "It's not," Laura replied, undeterred. "Miss Angela seems to have stirred something in you. Something you've kept locked away for far too long." Arthur didn't respond, but her words lingered in his mind as he made his way down the steps toward Angela. When she noticed him approaching, Angela stood and brushed the soil from her hands onto the apron Laura had insisted she wear. "I didn't know you liked flowers," Arthur said casually, stopping a few feet away. "I don't know if I like them," Angela replied with a small shrug. "I just think it's good to do something useful." He chuckled, a rare, genuine sound. "That's already more than I've ever done for this garden. Laura always said it was only for appearances." Angela raised an eyebrow, a hint of a smile on her lips. "Everything here seems to be for appearances, including you." Arthur blinked, momentarily caught off guard by her bluntness. But instead of feeling offended, he found himself admiring her candor. "Maybe you're right," he admitted, his tone reflective. "But appearances often conceal more than they reveal." Angela smiled softly but didn't reply. She could see he was trying to open up, but she also knew Arthur's way. He only revealed as much as he wanted others to see. Later that afternoon, Arthur made a rare decision. He walked into the dining room just as Angela finished her lunch, his tone decisive. "We're going out," he announced. Angela looked up, surprised. "Out? Where?" "You'll see," he said simply, his expression unreadable. Intrigued but wary, Angela set her napkin down and rose to follow him, wondering what this unexpected outing might reveal about the man who was steadily becoming a puzzle she was determined to solve. Out? Where? Angela asked, her tone skeptical as she studied Arthur's expression. Just trust me this time, he said, his voice calm yet unyielding. Though hesitant, Angela agreed. She followed him to the car, where Arthur took the driver's seat and navigated them to a quiet park on the edge of the city. Unlike the lavish surroundings Angela had grown used to at the mansion, this place was modest and unassuming. Tall trees cast dappled shadows over winding paths, and wooden benches lined the peaceful trails. It was a haven of tranquility, far removed from the chaos of urban life. As Angela stepped out of the car, she looked around, genuinely surprised. "Why here?" she asked, unable to hide her curiosity. Arthur's gaze softened slightly. "I thought you might appreciate a place where you could just breathe," he replied. They walked in silence for a while, the quiet hum of nature filling the space between them. When they reached a small lake, Angela paused, taking in the serene view. The glassy water reflected the trees and sky, creating a scene so peaceful that it stirred something deep within her. "This is beautiful," she said quietly, breaking the stillness. Arthur turned to look at her, his expression unguarded for a brief moment. "You deserve beautiful things too, Angela." His sincerity caught her off guard, and she turned toward him, unsure of how to respond. Before she could find the words, Arthur glanced away, clearly uncomfortable with the vulnerability he had just displayed. After some time, they found a bench near the lake and sat down. The calm atmosphere seemed to draw out a different side of Angela, and she began sharing small, fond memories from her childhood, stories of simpler, happier times before life became so cruel. Arthur listened intently, his focus entirely on her, a level of attention that felt oddly out of place coming from someone like him. "And you?" Angela asked suddenly, catching him off guard. "What was your childhood like?" Arthur was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the rippling water. "Lonely," he admitted finally. "My parents were busy people. They gave me everything money could buy, but not much else. I grew up surrounded by wealth, but I was usually on my own." Angela heard the bitterness in his voice and saw a flicker of pain in his eyes. For the first time, she saw him as someone who also bore invisible scars, wounds that shaped him as much as hers had shaped her. "I guess, in the end, we're all just trying to overcome something," she said softly, a sad smile tugging at her lips. Arthur nodded, his silence an acknowledgement of the truth in her words. The ride back to the mansion was quiet, but not uncomfortably so. Angela's thoughts swirled with the day's unexpected revelations, and she couldn't help but feel that, for the first time, she had glimpsed a genuine side of Arthur. There was something between them now, something that went beyond the constraints of their agreement. When they arrived, Arthur stopped the car but didn't move to get out right away. Instead, he turned to her, his expression unusually thoughtful. "Angela, I know there's a lot about me that doesn't make sense to you," he said after a pause. "But I need you to know you're not alone here." Her heart raced at his words. Despite her resolve to keep her emotional distance, the sincerity in his voice stirred something within her. She lowered her gaze, her voice soft. "Thank you." That night, Angela lay in bed, replaying the day in her mind. The simple outing, the unexpected honesty in their conversations. It had all left her feeling both comforted and unsettled. Arthur was still a puzzle, but he was beginning to show cracks in the wall he had so carefully built around himself. Meanwhile, in his office, Arthur sat alone, staring at nothing in particular. He was painfully aware that he was becoming more invested in Angela than he had ever intended. She had awakened something in him, a part of himself he had buried long ago. He didn't know whether it was hope, guilt, or something more, but whatever it was, it terrified him. In the days that followed their visit to the park, the change in their dynamic became undeniable. Arthur was more present, his guarded demeanor softening in subtle ways. Yet, despite the connection they were beginning to build, he still maintained that invisible barrier, making him as enigmatic as ever. Angela couldn't help but wonder, What was he so afraid of letting her see? As Angela wandered through the mansion, she stumbled upon a small room tucked away on the lower floor. Unlike the rest of the house's grand opulence, this space was humble, almost forgotten, with worn furniture and an air of neglect. Intrigued, she stepped inside, her curiosity piqued. The room seemed like an old office, with scattered papers and a desk bearing scratches from years of use. As she opened an unlocked drawer, a folder caught her attention. Her name was scrawled across the label in bold letters. Her heart thudded in her chest. Why would Arthur have a folder with her name on it? Her hands trembled as she picked up the file, the weight of her decision to open it pressing heavily on her mind. But her curiosity overpowered her hesitation, and she flipped it open. What she found inside chilled her. Detailed health reports, a meticulous timeline of her life over the past few years, and even information about her struggles on the streets. It was all there. Her pain, her struggles, her most private moments, laid bare in stark black ink. But what shocked her most were the medical records, some from tests she didn't even remember agreeing to. Her thoughts raced back to the recent consultations and the unsettling precision of the questions. Now it all fit together. This wasn't just about a sham marriage. Arthur wanted something more, something she couldn't yet piece together. Lost in the file's contents, Angela didn't notice the firm footsteps approaching until they were nearly at the door. She looked up sharply as Arthur entered, his movement halting when his eyes fell on her holding the folder. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice quiet but laced with tension. Angela's anger surged. She stood, holding up the folder with a trembling hand. "You owe me an explanation," she demanded, her voice low but fiery. "What is this? Why do you have my entire life laid out here? And these tests, what were they for?" Arthur shut the door behind him, exhaling slowly. He had known this moment would come but hadn't expected it so soon. He walked toward her, his movements measured, trying to maintain control. "Angela," he said evenly, "I can explain." "Then explain," she snapped, her voice rising. "I deserve the truth." Arthur hesitated, carefully weighing his words. He couldn't reveal everything, not yet. But he also couldn't risk destroying what fragile trust existed between them. "When I decided to approach you, I needed to be certain you were the right person for what I needed," he began, his tone steady but guarded. "The medical tests were part of that. I had to confirm you were healthy. It wasn't personal, it was professional." Angela stared at him, her disbelief turning into anger. "Professional?" she echoed, her voice shaking. "How can you even say that? You've turned my life into a business deal. And isn't that what it is?" Arthur shot back, his voice sharper than he intended. "We have a contract, Angela. You agreed to this." His words hit her like a physical blow, and she instinctively stepped back, her fury boiling over. "I agreed because I had no choice," she shouted. "You knew that. You knew how desperate I was, and you used it against me." Arthur closed his eyes briefly, his jaw tightening as he fought to keep his frustration in check. "I didn't want it to be this way," he said, his voice softer now. "But it's complicated." "Complicated?" Angela let out a bitter laugh. "You have no idea what complicated is, Arthur. You don't know what it's like to lose everything, to be treated like you don't matter, to feel invisible." Arthur opened his mouth to argue but stopped himself. Her words hung heavy in the air, and he couldn't deny the truth of them. No matter how he tried to frame his actions, nothing in his privileged life compared to what Angela had endured. For a moment, the room fell silent. Angela's chest heaved with emotion, and Arthur stood still, staring at the ground, unable to meet her gaze. He had always prided himself on control, but in that moment, he realized just how powerless he truly was. "Tell me the truth, Arthur. Why did you really choose me?" Angela's voice was quieter now, but the emotion in her words made them hit harder. Her gaze bore into him, demanding honesty. Arthur hesitated, staring back at her. He saw the anger and hurt in her eyes and felt the pull to reveal everything. But he couldn't, not yet. The plan was still fragile, and too much truth could unravel everything. I chose you because I thought we could help each other, he said finally, his voice steady but guarded. I needed someone who understood what it means to start over, and you needed a chance to begin again. Angela stayed silent, processing his words. They sounded genuine, almost heartfelt, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more. There was always more when it came to Arthur. That's not enough for me, Arthur, she said after a long pause. I need honesty. If you can't give me that, then maybe I should leave. Her words hit him harder than he expected. He knew their marriage was meant to be temporary, but the thought of Angela leaving now felt wrong, unnatural. I don't want you to go, he said, his tone softening, the walls around his emotions cracking slightly. I need you here. Angela didn't respond. Her expression was unreadable as she placed the folder back in his hands and walked out of the room. Arthur stood there, staring at the documents, feeling a heaviness he couldn't explain. Later, Angela found herself in the garden, trying to calm the storm of emotions swirling in her mind. Arthur's words echoed in her thoughts. I need you here. There was something in the way he'd said it that unsettled her. It felt personal. But Arthur was a man who operated with purpose. Everything he did was calculated, deliberate. So what did he really mean? What did he truly want from her? Meanwhile, Arthur sat in his office, the folder still on his desk. He stared at its contents, barely seeing the words. His focus was elsewhere, on Angela. She was beginning to affect him in ways he hadn't anticipated. He had always been disciplined, his emotions kept tightly under control. But now those defenses were slipping. Angela made him feel things he thought he had buried long ago. And that scared him. As the days passed, the tension between them grew. Angela couldn't bring herself to trust Arthur after discovering the folder. The moments of vulnerability he had shown were not enough to override the secrets he continued to keep. She felt trapped in a contract that seemed inescapable, a pawn in a game she didn't understand. The helplessness gnawed at her, and she knew she needed to find a way out. One morning, as she wandered through the garden, Angela's thoughts raced. She glanced at the tall gate at the edge of the property, its heavy lock gleaming in the sunlight. Her heart ached for freedom, for a sense of control over her own life again. I have to figure a way out, she murmured to herself, her resolve hardening. That afternoon, while Arthur was absorbed in a meeting with his lawyer, Angela began discreetly observing the routines of the staff. She paid close attention to the delivery schedules, noting the brief moments when the gate was unlocked. It wasn't much, but it was a chance, a risky one, but better than staying in a house full of unanswered questions. That night, Angela packed a small bag, carefully choosing only the items she considered essential. She stared at the bag for a long moment, her heart pounding in her chest. The weight of what she was about to do settled heavily on her shoulders. But the thought of staying, of enduring the suffocating secrets and lies, felt worse. This has to work, she thought, steeling herself for what lay ahead. Angela packed only the essentials. A few clothes, a book Laura had lent her, and an old photograph of her parents, framed by Arthur, in a gesture that had initially touched her but now only deepened her confusion. She clutched the frame for a moment, debating whether to take it, before slipping it into her bag. It felt like a piece of herself she couldn't leave behind. As dawn broke, Angela was ready. Dressed in a simple outfit and sturdy shoes, she waited near the garden, her heart pounding. When she heard the creak of the gate opening for a delivery, she moved quickly and quietly, using the commotion to stay out of sight. Her pulse quickened as she approached the threshold. Freedom was just steps away. But before she could cross, a firm hand gripped her arm. Where do you think you're going? Arthur's voice was calm but carried an unmistakable edge. Angela turned, startled, her heart racing. He stood there, his face unreadable, though his eyes betrayed something deeper, hurt. Let me go, Arthur, she said, pulling against his grip. I can't stay here. And why not? He asked, his tone steady as he tightened his hold slightly. Because you don't trust me? Because you think I'm hiding something? Yes, Angela snapped, the dam of her emotions breaking. You know everything about me, but you refuse to tell me the truth. This place, It's beautiful, yes, but it's a prison. I don't know what you want from me, and it's killing me. Arthur exhaled slowly and released her arm, though he moved to block her path. You can't leave. It's not safe. Safe? She shot back, crossing her arms. Safe for who? For me? Or for your plan? His silence was damning. The hesitation in his response confirmed what she had feared. That's what I thought, Angela said, her voice heavy with frustration. Arthur raked a hand through his hair, his agitation showing in the tense set of his shoulders. Angela, I know this all feels wrong. I know I've handled things in the worst way possible. But I can't let you go. Not now. Why? She asked, her voice raw with desperation. What do you really want from me, Arthur? He met her gaze, and for a fleeting moment, she saw vulnerability in his eyes. I don't know how to answer that, he admitted, lowering his head as though the admission cost him something. The unexpected honesty caught Angela off guard. She had braced herself for anger, manipulation, or deflection. But not this. Not this quiet, almost fragile sincerity. Still, she wasn't ready to back down. Her freedom was too important. That's not enough for me, she said firmly. I need answers, Arthur. And until you're honest with me, I don't see any reason to stay. Arthur stepped back, breathing deeply as if trying to steady himself. If you really want to leave, he said after a pause, I won't stop you, but I need you to know something. Care about you, far more than I should. His confession hung in the air between them, raw and unguarded. Angela stood frozen, trying to process what he had just said. She had expected control, even manipulation, but not this. And if I stay? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Will you stop treating me like a contract? Arthur nodded slowly. I'll try. Angela looked past him at the open gate, now a symbol of the choice she had to make. The chance to leave was right there, but something rooted her in place. Perhaps it was her curiosity about the man standing before her, the flicker of humanity behind his stoic facade. Or maybe it was the vulnerability he had just shown, so at odds with the Arthur she thought she knew. All right, she said finally. I'll stay. For now. Relief washed over Arthur's face, though his expression still held a complexity she couldn't decipher. Without another word, she turned and walked back into the mansion. Later, in the quiet of her room, Angela sat on the edge of her bed, her thoughts racing. The idea of leaving still lingered in her mind, a persistent whisper reminding her that she didn't owe him anything. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't the right time. Not yet. There was more to Arthur than he was letting on. And now, she was determined to find out what he was hiding. There was something about Arthur that Angela couldn't ignore. Despite her frustration and mistrust, a part of her was drawn to him, compelled to understand the enigmatic man behind the calculated facade. She needed answers before she could decide her next move. Meanwhile, Arthur stood by the window in his office, his gaze fixed on the distant gate. Relief mingled with unease as he reflected on Angela's decision to stay. He knew it wouldn't last if he didn't change his approach. If he kept her in the dark, she'd eventually leave, and this time, he might not be able to stop her. Angela's unease grew with each passing day. Arthur's small gestures of kindness and attempts to build trust couldn't erase the sense that something darker lurked beneath his actions. The unanswered questions weighed on her, making it impossible to relax or trust him fully. That afternoon, determined to uncover the truth, Angela wandered the mansion's corridors. Her steps slowed as her eyes landed on Arthur's bedroom door. It was shut but unlocked. Knowing he was out at a business meeting, she hesitated briefly before pushing the door open. The room was as orderly and elegant as she had expected, with dark wood furniture and meticulously arranged decor. It reflected Arthur perfectly, controlled, pragmatic, and without a hint of vulnerability. As her gaze swept the room, a black folder on a cabinet caught her attention. Its placement seemed careless, as though it had been left in haste. Her heart raced as she approached the cabinet. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the folder. What if I find something I can't handle? She thought, But the pull of curiosity was too strong. With trembling hands, she opened it. The first pages confirmed her suspicions. They were medical reports. She quickly recognized the tests she had undergone since her arrival. But as she flipped further, dread coiled in her stomach. These weren't ordinary health reports. They were focused exclusively on her reproductive health. One line stopped her cold. Ideal conditions for gestation confirmed. The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. It all made sense now, the medical appointments, the invasive questions, Arthur's insistence on monitoring her health. This wasn't about a marriage. It was about her body. To him, she wasn't a partner. She was a vessel. Betrayal hit her like a wave as she flipped through the pages, each line reducing her to an object, evaluated and chosen for a purpose she hadn't consented to. Arthur had planned everything, from the moment he first approached her, with meticulous precision. He had known everything about her before she even knew his name. So absorbed in the file, Angela didn't hear the approaching footsteps until the door opened. She looked up sharply as Arthur stepped inside, his face freezing when he saw her holding the folder. For a moment, his mask slipped, revealing shock, but he quickly composed himself. "Angela," he said, his voice low and tense. "What are you doing?" Tears streamed down her cheeks as she turned to face him. "I'm finally learning the truth, Arthur," she said, her voice cracking. She threw the folder onto the bed. "You didn't want a wife. You wanted a womb." Arthur shut the door behind him and exhaled slowly, his face hardening. "It's not that simple." "Not that simple?" Angela's voice rose, trembling with anger and hurt. "Then explain it to me, Arthur. Explain how you thought it was okay to treat me like a thing, a piece of property you could use for your plans." Arthur took a step toward her, his hands raised in a placating gesture. But she stepped back, the distance between them heavy with distrust. "I needed an heir, Angela," he admitted, his voice steady but lined with tension. "I needed to secure the future of my family and my business," Arthur said, his tone steady but tinged with desperation. "It wasn't something I could leave to chance. And you seemed like the right person." "The right person?" Angela let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head in disbelief. "You don't even know me, Arthur. You only knew that I was desperate, that I had no other choice. And you used that against me. You planned everything from the start without ever giving me a choice." Arthur's expression shifted, guilt creeping into his features. "I never wanted to hurt you, Angela. Please, believe me." "Believe you?" she snapped, her voice trembling with fury. "How can I believe someone who's been lying from the very beginning? You manipulated everything, Arthur. You destroyed any chance of trust one might have had in you." Her words cut deep, and Arthur ran his hands over his face, frustration evident. "You don't understand what's at stake for me. My family, my business, everything depends on this. And you think that justifies what you've done?" Angela countered, her voice raw with pain. "Nothing justifies lying and deceiving someone like this." Arthur stepped closer, urgency etched in every movement. "Angela, please, give me a chance to explain. We can fix this. I can change things. Just don't leave." She turned away, her resolve firm, but Arthur reached out and grabbed her arm. His grip wasn't forceful, but it stopped her in her tracks. "Angela, please," he said again, his voice softer now. She looked back at him one last time. In his eyes, she saw something, regret, perhaps even sincerity, but it wasn't enough. "You had your chance, Arthur," she said, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to spill. "I don't trust you anymore." With that, she pulled her arm free and walked out of the office, leaving Arthur behind with his guilt and the echo of her words. That night, Angela packed her belongings in silence. Her mind raced as she folded the few items she had brought with her, placing them into a small bag. A part of her felt a lingering connection to Arthur, but the betrayal was too great to ignore, too profound to forgive. Before going to bed, she paused, her hand resting gently on her abdomen. The possibility that she might be pregnant weighed heavily on her mind. It was a reality she couldn't avoid, but she knew she would have to face it alone. The next morning, a heavy stillness settled over the mansion. Angela was gone before anyone noticed. When Arthur woke, he half expected to find her in the garden or the living room, but her absence was undeniable. The house seemed emptier than it had ever been. Laura, the housekeeper, approached him hesitantly. "Miss Angela?" she began, her voice uncertain. "She's gone. I brought breakfast to her room, but it was empty." Arthur stood silent, her words hitting him harder than he anticipated. He had feared this after their confrontation the night before, but hearing it confirmed was different. He nodded slowly, keeping his voice even. "Thank you, Laura. That'll be all for now." Once alone, Arthur sank onto the sofa, his head in his hands. The black folder Angela had discovered lay on the coffee table in front of him, an unavoidable reminder of the choices that had led to this moment. His plan had always been calculated, pragmatic. He had never accounted for the emotional fallout, hers or his own. Hours later, Arthur sat in his office, staring blankly at a stack of documents. The pages blurred before his eyes, meaningless in the shadow of her absence. Every attempt to focus was interrupted by the memory of Angela's face, her pain, her anger, the betrayal in her eyes. Finally, unable to endure the silence any longer, he picked up the phone. Dialing the number of the driver who had regularly taken Angela to her appointments, Arthur waited as the line connected. "I need to know where Angela went," Arthur ordered, his voice tight with urgency. "Sir," the driver replied, "she didn't request a car. She left on foot, carrying a small bag." The response unsettled him. Angela was out there alone, with little money or resources, and the thought of her facing the world without support gnawed at him. Hanging up the phone, Arthur leaned back in his chair, a rare and unfamiliar sense of helplessness washing over him. He had always prided himself on control, over his business, his life, everything, but now he felt adrift. For all his wealth, power, and connections, none of it seemed sufficient to undo the damage he had caused. Meanwhile, Angela walked through the city streets, her resolve battling exhaustion. Her heart ached with betrayal, but she was determined to move forward, one difficult step at a time. Returning to that mansion, to Arthur's carefully constructed world of control and manipulation, was unthinkable. By evening, she found refuge in a rundown motel. The walls were thin, the furniture sparse, and the air carried the faint scent of dampness, but it was all she could afford with her small stash of savings. Sitting on the edge of the creaky bed, Angela stared at her bag, still trying to process the whirlwind of emotions and revelations from the past few days. Her hand moved instinctively to her abdomen, a gesture she barely noticed. A mix of fear and hope bubbled within her. Am I pregnant? The thought had been lingering in the back of her mind, and now, in the stillness of the room, it came rushing to the forefront. The signs were there, the nausea, the fatigue, but she wasn't ready to confirm it. Not yet. First, she needed to decide what this meant for her future. Arthur spent the rest of the day in his office, trying to drown out the oppressive silence of the mansion. Every corner seemed to carry a reminder of Angela, her presence, her absence, and the consequences of his actions. Finally, unable to bear the uncertainty any longer, he called Laura into his office. "I want you to find Angela," he said, sliding an envelope across the desk. Inside was a significant amount of money and a detailed set of instructions. "Find out where she is and make sure she's safe." Laura, though surprised, nodded. She had worked for Arthur long enough to recognize when his concern extended beyond mere responsibility. "And if she doesn't want to be found?" she asked gently. "Then don't push her," he replied, his voice softer. "But make sure she has what she needs." Laura left without another word, leaving Arthur alone once more. He stared at the phone on his desk, debating whether to call Angela directly, but he knew words wouldn't be enough to fix the chasm between them. He had to tread carefully. Too much, too soon, and he risked driving her even further away. A few days later, Laura returned with the information Arthur had requested. "She's staying at a small motel in a quieter part of the city," she reported. "She seems well, but she's avoiding contact with anyone connected to you. She's safe, Arthur asked, though the thought of her alone in such a place unsettled him. She is, but it's clear she doesn't want to be found by you. Laura handed him a short report detailing Angela's whereabouts and condition. Arthur took the paper, his eyes scanning the lines. The image of Angela in that modest motel, carrying the weight of his betrayal, struck a nerve. He tapped the report lightly against the desk, considering his next move. "Leave her an anonymous amount," he finally ordered. "Make sure she doesn't know it's from me." Laura hesitated, her curiosity evident. "Do you plan to tell her the truth? Or will you let the silence keep growing between you?" Arthur didn't answer right away. He stared at the report, his thoughts heavy with the consequences of honesty. After a long pause, he said, "Not yet, but I will, when the time is right." Angela, meanwhile, was beginning to plan her next steps. The motel was a temporary solution, but she knew she couldn't stay there forever. Nor could she return to the streets. It wasn't an option she was willing to accept. She resolved to start fresh, to rebuild her life far away from Arthur and the tangled web of his plans. As she packed her belongings into her bag, her eyes fell on an envelope resting by the door. Frowning, she picked it up and turned it over in her hands. There was no name, no indication of who had left it. Opening it carefully, she found a stack of cash inside. Her stomach churned. She didn't need to guess where it had come from. Opening the envelope, Angela found a significant amount of money inside. There was no name, no sender, but she didn't need one to know who had left it. "Arthur?" she murmured, her emotions conflicting. A mix of anger at his presumption and gratitude for the lifeline he'd offered. She placed the envelope in her bag and stepped out of the motel room. It was time to move forward, even though she knew the past wouldn't let her go so easily. Days turned into weeks, but Angela's absence continued to haunt Arthur. Each night, he found himself staring at the black folder that had set everything in motion, the documents within an unflinching reminder of his choices. For the first time, he began to question not just his actions, but the kind of man he had become. Arthur's life had always revolved around control. He had been raised to believe that success came from leaving nothing to chance, from manipulating every variable to secure an outcome. But Angela had disrupted that belief. She had brought something unfamiliar into his carefully constructed world: vulnerability. And he didn't know what to do with it. One morning, as he reviewed financial reports, a wave of frustration overwhelmed him. The numbers, the profits, they felt meaningless in the face of the emptiness consuming him. Abruptly, he stood and decided he couldn't go on like this. Something had to change. Arthur began making bold, drastic adjustments to his life. He severed ties with business partners whose practices he had long despised, even if they had been profitable. Contracts rooted in unethical foundations were canceled. He redirected his investments toward projects focused on creating social impact: schools, community programs, renewable energy initiatives. His team was baffled by the sudden shift, but Arthur no longer cared. For the first time, he wanted to do something that wasn't purely strategic. But as he worked to rebuild his values, one thought remained constant: Angela. He knew his transformation wouldn't be complete without addressing the damage he had done to her. Yet he hesitated, unsure of how to approach her without it seeming forced or insincere. Meanwhile, Angela was quietly rebuilding her life. The money Arthur had left allowed her to rent a modest apartment. It was small and unremarkable, but to her it was everything. A chance to start over on her own terms. She spent her days searching for work, pouring her energy into creating a future free from manipulation and control. But despite her best efforts, thoughts of Arthur lingered. She wondered if he regretted what he had done, if he understood the depth of the hurt he had caused her. Yet the idea of trusting him again felt nearly impossible. One afternoon, as Angela organized her belongings, a sudden wave of dizziness struck her. She sat down, pressing a hand to her forehead. The exhaustion of the past few days had been relentless, but this was different. Her suspicions grew stronger, her thoughts drifting back to the signs she had been ignoring. With a heavy heart, she decided to confirm what she had long suspected. Walking to a nearby pharmacy, Angela bought a pregnancy test and returned to her apartment. Sitting on the edge of her bed, she held the test in her hands, waiting for the result with bated breath. When the confirmation appeared, her chest tightened. She was pregnant, and the child was Arthur's. A whirlwind of emotions consumed her. Joy, fear, uncertainty. This changed everything. Yet she wasn't ready to decide what to do. The weight of the decision felt almost paralyzing. At the same time, Arthur was searching for a way to reconnect with Angela. He knew where she was but had chosen to respect her need for space. The thought of forcing his presence into her life felt wrong, but the ache of her absence was undeniable. Somehow, he needed to show her that he was different, that he was willing to change. Not just for her, but because of her. He just didn't know if she would ever give him the chance. After receiving Laura's latest update on Angela's state, Arthur realized he couldn't delay any longer. "I need to talk to her," he muttered to himself, pacing in his office. Apologies alone wouldn't suffice. He needed to prove that he had changed, that he was willing to let go of the control that had defined him for so long. A few days later, Angela was startled by an unexpected knock at her apartment door. Opening it cautiously, she found Arthur standing there, a bouquet of flowers in his hands. He looked different, less composed, less calculating. Vulnerability softened his usual stoic expression. "Arthur," she said, her voice a mix of surprise and caution. "What are you doing here?" "I needed to see you," he replied, sincerity clear in his tone. "I know this might not be the best time, but I can't move forward without trying to make things right." Angela crossed her arms, keeping the emotional wall she had built firmly in place. "Make things right? Arthur, you don't understand how much you hurt me. This isn't something flowers can fix." He nodded, her words hitting him squarely. "I know, and I'm not here expecting forgiveness, not right away. I'm here because I need to tell you the truth. All of it." Angela hesitated, her emotions warring inside her. Could she handle hearing what he had to say? After a long pause, she stepped aside and gestured for him to enter. They sat in the modest living room, the silence thick with tension. Arthur clasped his hands together, taking a moment to collect his thoughts before speaking. "When I made my proposal, I wasn't thinking about anyone but myself," he began, his voice steady but laced with regret. "My entire world has always revolved around control, making sure everything fits into my plans. You became part of that plan, and I deeply regret treating you that way." He paused, taking a deep breath. "But as I spent time with you, I realized something I wasn't prepared for. You weren't just part of a plan. You showed me something I didn't even know I needed. A real connection. You made me see that life isn't just about business and strategies." Angela listened quietly, his words settling heavily in the room. Trusting him again felt impossible, but there was a rawness to his voice she hadn't heard before. "And what am I supposed to do with this, Arthur?" she asked, her tone softer but still guarded. "Nothing," he said simply. "I don't expect anything from you. I just needed you to know that I'm changing, that I want to be better, not just for myself, but for you, and for whatever the future holds." Her heart skipped a beat at the last phrase. She studied his face, searching for signs of what he might know. "The future?" she asked, keeping her tone calm even as her chest tightened. Arthur held her gaze, his eyes searching hers. "I don't want to assume, Angela, but I hope that one day you'll find it in yourself to trust me again, no matter how long it takes." Tears welled in her eyes, and she let them fall silently. "I need time, Arthur," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need to figure out what all of this means for me." He nodded, standing slowly as if to give her space. "I understand. I just wanted you to know that I'll be here when you're ready." Before leaving, he placed the bouquet gently on the table. He looked at her one last time, his expression a mix of regret and hope. "Thank you for listening, Angela," he said softly, and then he was gone. When the door closed, Angela sank into her chair, her eyes fixed on the flowers. Her thoughts swirled as she tried to make sense of everything. Something inside her told her that Arthur was being truthful, that he was genuinely trying to change. But the betrayal, the feeling of being used, it wasn't something she could easily forget. Her hand moved instinctively to her abdomen, the weight of her pregnancy suddenly overwhelming her. The confirmation had complicated everything. Trusting Arthur again would take more than an apology, more than flowers. She needed to decide what her next steps would be, for herself and for the life growing inside her. Angela sat on the couch, her eyes fixed on the bouquet Arthur had brought. The flowers were stunning, but their beauty couldn't mask the storm of emotions swirling inside her. Placing a hand gently on her abdomen, she felt the weight of the responsibility ahead. It wasn't just about her anymore. She had a child to think about now, and every decision she made carried greater stakes. The next day, Angela decided to seek medical care to confirm her pregnancy and ensure everything was progressing well. She found a small, welcoming clinic nearby, where a middle-aged doctor with a kind smile reassured her every step of the way. "You're in excellent health," the doctor said as she adjusted the ultrasound machine. "And the baby seems to be developing perfectly." Angela's breath caught as the doctor turned the screen toward her, showing the first flickering signs of life. The tiny heartbeat on the monitor made everything real. Tears welled in her eyes as she gazed at the image. A new life was growing inside her, filling her with a mixture of joy and fear. The weight of uncertainty about the future pressed down on her even harder. Meanwhile, Arthur wrestled with his own emotions. He had done everything he could think of to show Angela he was trying to change, but he knew it might not be enough. Giving her the space she had asked for was necessary, but the uncertainty of her silence was gnawing at him. Determined to act in a meaningful way, Arthur began discreetly planning to support Angela and the baby without imposing on her. He hired a lawyer to set up an account in her name, depositing enough money to cover her and the baby's needs for years to come. The gesture wasn't about control. It was an attempt to make amends in the only way he could think of. But deep down, Arthur knew that no financial support could replace what truly mattered to him: the chance to be part of Angela's life and their child's future. A few days later, Angela was startled by a knock at her door. When she opened it, Laura stood on the threshold, holding an envelope and wearing a look of quiet concern. "Arthur asked me to deliver this to you," Laura said, handing over the envelope. Angela hesitated before taking it, her heart racing as she closed the door behind her. Sitting down, she opened the envelope and found legal documents inside. They detailed an account in her name, containing enough money to ensure her financial stability. At the bottom of the envelope was a handwritten letter from Arthur. "Angela, I want you to know that no matter what you decide, I'll be here to support you and the baby. This account was created to ensure you have everything you need. This is not about control, it's about repairing, at least in part, the harm I've caused. I hope this gesture shows you that my intentions are different now. Sincerely, Arthur." Angela's throat tightened as she finished reading. Her emotions warred within her. On one hand, it felt like yet another attempt by Arthur to exert influence over her life. On the other, the words seemed genuine, a clear effort to show he was trying to change. "He's really trying, isn't he?" Angela asked Laura later, her voice hesitant and unsure. Laura gave her a small, encouraging smile. "Mr. Lehman has changed a lot since you left. He's never been this vulnerable before, but I believe he's learning." Angela nodded silently, turning Laura's words over in her mind. That night, she lay in bed, tossing and turning, unable to sleep. Her thoughts kept circling back to Arthur, his letter, and the gesture he had made. Finally, she sat up, her decision clear. "I need to talk to Arthur," she whispered into the stillness of her apartment. Angela didn't know exactly what she would say, but she knew she couldn't keep avoiding the conversation. The next morning, she called Arthur. He answered almost immediately, his voice tinged with surprise and relief. "Angela, is everything okay?" he asked quickly. "Can we meet?" she replied, her tone steady. "I need to talk to you." "Of course," he said without hesitation. "Whenever and wherever you want." They agreed to meet at a small cafe in the city center. Angela chose the location carefully. It was neutral, a place where she could feel more in control. When she arrived, she spotted Arthur already seated, his expression anxious and uncertain. As soon as he saw her, he stood, greeting her with a quiet, "Thank you for meeting me." Angela sat down, her posture firm, her gaze unwavering. "I'm not here to start over, Arthur," she began. "I'm here because we need to talk about the baby." He froze for a moment, the weight of her words sinking in. Though he had suspected this might be the case, hearing the confirmation left him momentarily stunned. "You're pregnant?" he asked softly, his voice heavy with emotion. Angela nodded. "Yes, and this changes everything." Arthur leaned forward, his eyes locked on hers. "Angela, no matter what's happened between us, I want to be part of this. I want to be there for the baby, and for you if you'll let me." Angela studied him carefully. His words sounded sincere, but the shadow of doubt lingered in her heart. "I don't know if I can trust you, Arthur. You broke that trust, and rebuilding it won't be easy." "I understand," he said quietly, "but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to prove myself to you. And more than that, I'm committed to being the father this baby deserves." She didn't respond immediately, weighing his words. There was something undeniably different about him, a gentleness she hadn't seen before. But she had to be cautious, for her own sake and the baby's. "Let's take things slow," she said finally. "I can't promise anything, but I'm willing to give you a chance to prove you've really changed." Relief washed over Arthur's face, but he kept his response measured. "Thank you, Angela. I promise I won't disappoint you." As they said their goodbyes, Angela felt a faint glimmer of hope. She didn't know what the future would hold, but she was willing to take it one step at a time. In the days that followed their meeting, cautious steps and small gestures began to rebuild the fragile connection between Angela and Arthur. They were bound by something larger than themselves, the new life growing inside her. Though mistrust still lingered, Angela couldn't deny that Arthur was keeping his promises. He began accompanying her to medical appointments, always staying respectfully in the background. His attentiveness was evident. He was punctual, engaged, and ready to step in if needed, yet he never pushed beyond the boundaries she set. During one appointment, as the doctor explained the baby's progress, Arthur found himself captivated by the moment. He watched Angela with an expression that was a mix of wonder and regret, his gaze lingering on her as she listened intently to the doctor's words. "Are you okay?" Angela asked, catching his gaze and breaking him out of his thoughts. Arthur shook his head slightly, as if snapping out of a trance. "I am. It's just—" He paused, his voice softening. "It's incredible, knowing that something so special is happening, and that somehow, I'm part of it." Angela looked away, unsure how to respond. The sincerity in his words caught her off guard, and for the first time in a long while, she felt the faint stirrings of vulnerability. She wasn't ready to lower her guard completely, but she couldn't deny that Arthur's efforts were beginning to make a difference. Part of Angela wanted to believe Arthur, to trust the sincerity in his words and actions, but the fear of being hurt again weighed heavily on her heart. After one of her appointments, Arthur suggested they have lunch at a quiet restaurant. Angela hesitated but eventually agreed. It felt like the right moment to discuss what they both envisioned for the future. As they sat at the table waiting for their food, Arthur broke the silence. "Angela, I want you to know that I'm not here just because of the baby," he said, his voice steady but vulnerable. "I'm here because I genuinely want to be part of your life, not because of a contract or obligation, but because you mean something to me." Angela inhaled deeply, her hands resting protectively on her growing belly. "It's hard to trust that, Arthur," she replied honestly. "You manipulated me, took advantage of the lowest moment of my life to put me in a position I didn't choose. And now, even with everything you're doing, it still feels insufficient." Arthur nodded, her words cutting deep but deservedly so. "I know I made terrible choices," he admitted, "and I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I'm willing to do whatever it takes to prove to you that I've changed." For the first time, Angela saw something in Arthur she hadn't before, raw vulnerability. His openness moved her, though she wasn't ready to fully admit it, not even to herself. As the months passed and her belly grew, so did the complexity of Angela's feelings toward Arthur. He was always present, helping her prepare the small apartment for the baby's arrival. He respected the boundaries she had set, yet his desire to be closer to her was evident in every careful action and word. One evening, as they organized baby clothes together, Angela finally broke the lingering silence between them. "Why are you so determined to fix everything, Arthur?" she asked softly, folding a tiny onesie in her lap. He paused, setting down the clothes in his hands, and turned to face her. "Because, for the first time in my life, I've realized that what I truly want can't be bought or planned," he said, his voice earnest. "You and this baby, you're the only things that matter to me now." A tear slipped down Angela's cheek before she quickly brushed it away. "And what if I can't trust you again? What if it's never enough?" Arthur gave her a small, somber smile. "Then I'll keep trying, Angela," he said simply. "Even if it takes a lifetime." The moment that bound Angela and Arthur most deeply came on a quiet evening. Angela was at home when she began to feel sharp, persistent pain. At first, she dismissed it as something normal, but as the pain intensified, she knew something wasn't right. Laura, sensing something was wrong, called Arthur. He arrived minutes later, finding Angela on the couch, trying unsuccessfully to hide her concern. "Are you okay?" he asked, kneeling beside her, his voice laced with worry. "I think we need to go to the hospital," she said, her voice trembling. Without hesitation, Arthur grabbed the car keys and helped her to her feet. During the drive, he held her hand, his other gripping the steering wheel tightly. Though his own fear threatened to overwhelm him, he stayed calm for her sake. At the hospital, the doctors confirmed what Angela had feared. She was in premature labor. Arthur's heart raced, but he stayed by her side, his presence a steady anchor during the chaotic hours that followed. When the sound of a baby's cry finally filled the delivery room, relief and joy flooded Angela's heart. She held her tiny daughter in her arms, tears streaming down her face as she looked into her perfect little face. Arthur stood beside her, unable to take his eyes off the scene. His chest felt tight with emotions he couldn't fully describe: pride, awe, and a deep, overwhelming love for both Angela and their daughter. "She's perfect," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Angela looked up at him, her tear-streaked face softening. For the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope that perhaps, just perhaps, they could find a way forward together. Not just as parents, but as something more. Angela looked at Arthur, catching something in his eyes she had never seen before. A genuine purity, a joy that couldn't be feigned. It was raw, real, and undeniable. "Yes, she is," Angela said softly, a small smile breaking through her tired features. In the days that followed, Angela and Arthur spent most of their time at the hospital, ensuring that Lily received all the care she needed. The shared responsibility brought them closer in unexpected ways, creating a dynamic neither of them had anticipated. While Angela still harbored her reservations, she began to see Arthur in a new light, catching glimpses of the man he was trying to become. One evening, as Angela cradled the sleeping baby in her arms, Arthur approached, his expression calm yet thoughtful. "Have you thought of a name?" he asked gently. Angela glanced down at their daughter, her heart swelling with a tender warmth. "I was thinking Lily," she said, her voice light yet uncertain. "What do you think?" Arthur's smile widened, his eyes softening. "It's perfect." They sat in comfortable silence, watching Lily as she slept peacefully in Angela's arms. It was a simple moment, yet it carried a depth that spoke volumes about how far they had come. When they finally brought Lily home, Angela knew the road ahead would be long. She and Arthur weren't fully reconciled. Trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight. But something had shifted, something meaningful. They were now a family, and that changed everything. Arthur was relentless in demonstrating his commitment, not just to Lily, but to Angela as well. He respected her boundaries and understood that earning her trust would take time. Yet he was willing to wait as long as it took. For Angela, the cracks in her guarded heart began to widen, little by little. It wasn't just because of Lily, but because she started to see in Arthur a man who genuinely wanted to change. Despite the scars, she began to wonder if she could trust him again. The months following Lily's birth were a blend of challenges and small triumphs for Angela and Arthur. Each milestone, Lily's first smile, her laughter, her tiny movements, brought them closer together. The bond they shared now transcended contracts and expectations, grounded instead in the life they had created together. Though doubts still lingered, Angela couldn't deny Arthur's dedication. He was present for every moment, every late-night cry, and every quiet, beautiful smile that Lily gifted them. His efforts were steady and unwavering, proving his commitment through actions rather than words. One sunny afternoon, as Lily napped peacefully in her crib, Arthur found Angela sitting in the garden of their small apartment. She was on a bench, her gaze fixed on the flowers beginning to bloom, a serene yet contemplative expression on her face. "Thinking about something?" Arthur asked, approaching her with a gentle smile. Angela looked up, her eyes reflecting a mix of doubt and affection. "Thinking about how unpredictable life is. A few months ago, I never imagined I'd be here, with a daughter and with you." Arthur sat beside her, keeping a respectful distance. He understood that space was still something she needed, and he had learned to honor that. "And you?" Angela asked after a moment of silence, her tone curious but cautious. "What were you expecting when all this started?" Arthur sighed, his gaze drifting to the blooming flowers. "At first I thought I was in control, that I could plan everything out, like I always have." He paused, his voice softening. "But you showed me that life doesn't work that way. And, to be honest, I don't know if I've ever thanked you for that." Angela tilted her head, surprised by his honesty. "Thanked me for what?" "For showing me that the things that really matter can't be manipulated," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. "That love and trust aren't demanded, they're earned." His words struck a chord deep within Angela. She had spent so long protecting herself from Arthur's past actions. Yet here he was, laying bare his vulnerability in a way she hadn't thought possible. Slowly, she began to realize that holding on to the past might no longer serve her. As the months passed, Arthur continued to dedicate himself wholeheartedly to Angela and Lily. He was there for every laugh, every tear, and every small milestone, each of which brought a little more light into their lives. Angela, in turn, began to let her guard down, allowing him closer in ways she hadn't before. The scars of their past hadn't disappeared, but time, and Arthur's unwavering actions, were helping to heal them. For the first time in what felt like forever, Angela began to believe that a new beginning was possible. One quiet evening, as Lily slept peacefully in her crib, Arthur invited Angela to dinner. He took her to a charming restaurant he had recently discovered. The warm glow of candlelight and the soft hum of quiet conversation created an atmosphere perfect for the meaningful discussion he hoped to have. "This place is beautiful," Angela said, admiring the cozy ambience. "I thought it suited you," Arthur replied with a smile, his eyes reflecting the genuine affection he held for her. Over dinner, they reminisced about the turbulent beginnings of their relationship, finding humor in moments that had once seemed insurmountable. They laughed together, the shared memories weaving a sense of connection that felt new and refreshing. At one point, Arthur reached across the table and gently took Angela's hand in his. His expression softened as he leaned forward. "Angela, I know I've made so many mistakes, and I know I may never fully make up for them, but I want you to know that I love you, not because of Lily, not because of any plan, but because of who you are. I want to spend the rest of my life proving that to you." Angela sat quietly for a moment, her heart absorbing the weight of his words. She looked into his eyes and saw sincerity she could no longer deny. For the first time, she felt she could fully trust him. "I love you too," she replied softly, a smile spreading across her face. Arthur's breath caught, and for a moment, he seemed unable to contain his emotion. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out a small velvet box and opened it to reveal a simple yet elegant ring. "Angela," he began, his voice trembling slightly, "I know this may seem fast, but I'm ready for a fresh start. Will you marry me again? This time, no contracts, no hidden agendas." Just us, building a life together. Tears streamed down Angela's cheeks, but they were tears of joy. Yes, Arthur, I want to marry you. The ceremony that followed was simple, attended by only a handful of close friends and loved ones. Lily, dressed as an adorable flower girl, stole the show with her innocent charm, her giggles bringing smiles to everyone present. As they exchanged heartfelt vows, there were no secrets between Angela and Arthur this time. Only promises of love, trust, and partnership. Looking into Angela's eyes, Arthur spoke with conviction. I promise to love you, respect you, and strive every day to be the man you deserve. Angela, her voice steady despite the emotion welling up in her chest, replied, and I promise to trust you, support you, and walk by your side, no matter what challenges lie ahead. When they said, I do, the applause was drowned out by the overwhelming love and emotion that filled the air. They sealed the moment with a kiss, a symbol of the hope and promise their future held. After the ceremony, Arthur surprised Angela with a special gift. He had renovated the mansion, transforming it from a cold, imposing structure into a warm, inviting home filled with light and life. The garden, now brimming with flowers Angela had chosen herself, became the heart of the property. Welcome to our home, Arthur said, holding her hand as they walked through the entrance together. Angela gazed around, her heart swelling with gratitude and joy. This wasn't just a house anymore. It was a symbol of everything they had overcome. The days that followed were filled with happiness. Lily grew up surrounded by love, laughter, and the unwavering support of her parents. Angela and Arthur found a rhythm as a family, facing challenges together with trust and mutual respect. One sunny afternoon, as Lily played among the blooming flowers, Arthur reached for Angela's hand. I never thought I could be this happy, he said, his voice soft and full of wonder. Angela leaned her head on his shoulder, a contented smile on her lips. And I never thought I could trust you again. But you proved you were willing to change, and I'm grateful for that every single day. Arthur kissed her gently, their love strengthened by the trials they had endured. Nearby, Lily giggled, reaching for the flowers around her. What had started as a relationship mired in manipulation and mistrust had blossomed into something pure and genuine. United by their daughter, Angela and Arthur built the happy ending they had both longed for, together. What do you think about Angela's choice to forgive Arthur? Did they find the ending they deserved? Share your thoughts. Rate this story from 0 to 10, and don't forget to follow for more heartwarming tales.